Welcome into the Husker247 podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Michael Bruntz, Brian Christopherson, here on Friday, February 10th. Gentlemen, you have just continued to work through the Nebraska coaching staff. You got to meet with Bob Wager and Garret McGuire on Thursday. Both of them had their opportunity to stand in front of the Nebraska media. What takeaways did you immediately have? We'll start with Bob Wager and we'll start with Brian Christopherson.
Well, I think the jump from the high school ranks to his current position is interesting because you don't see it every day. But I thought he made a good point about, he'd coached at Arlington Martin for 17 years and way beyond that at other Texas high schools. And over that time, you kind of see everything under the sun. When you're a head coach at any level, you're going to deal with all sorts of different circumstances. Players are going to have obstacles and things that pop up that you're going to have to figure your way to navigate through with them. And so I thought he kind of hit on that and how, he basically has the same sort of way of looking at things and dealing with players and the off the field stuff as Matt Rule does. So I just feel like when Rule was at Baylor and actually made Arlington Martin one of his first stops, I believe Bob Wager said, it seems like they just sort of connected on more than just the X's and O's, but just sort of how you handle your operation as a coach. And so when you kind of put it all together, it was only 10 to 12 minutes we talked to him, but as introductions go, I think it makes sense why he's here. And I have absolutely no reservations about hiring guys who have coached down in Texas high school football for a long time, because that, as you guys know, covering recruiting as you do, that's a fierce beast down there. If you're going to be in the playoffs 17 years in a row like he was, you got to have something. You got to have your act together.
Bruntz, what were your thoughts on Bob Wager?
Yeah, I think Brian hit on most of it. I mean, I think that this is something that Matt Rule has done everywhere he's been, where he's promoted high school coaches into the college ranks, and he's going to take over what's kind of an interesting room because you lose Travis Vokalek. You're kind of in that transition period, I guess, for the tight end group where you've got Arik Gilbert coming in from Georgia. You have Thomas Fidone, who's been around, hasn't really played at all because of injuries. So, that group I think is going to be kind of under the microscope a little bit based on what we've heard from other coaches. It sounds like Nebraska is going to go a lot of 12 and sometimes 13 personnel. So the tight end is going to have a place there. So how he brings that group along will be interesting to follow. But I think Brian's right. I mean, I think this is a guy that's kind of seen everything in Texas high school football, even from an evaluation perspective. I mean, he coached Myles Garrett. I mean, he knows what a elite type prospect looks like, and he was involved a lot with the Under Armour All-American game. So that all is good, and I think too, just having the connections that he does in Dallas is going to help Nebraska, immeasurably, because I think they're really going to go and try and hammer home the fact that Nebraska is kind of the Big Ten team of Texas, and see what they can pull out of that area. And I think Dallas is probably the most fruitful area that they're going to find in the state in terms of being able to pull guys out in a little bit of a kind of right on the edge of that 500-mile radius.
Yeah, Bruntz, you mentioned this. The tight end room intrigued you a little bit. Arik Gilbert was one of the guys Nebraska added when I was largely sort of absent. What what do we make of that addition? What has Matt Rule sort of said about Arik Gilbert, and what does that do to the tight end room? I mean, I'm going back a couple of weeks, and I'm sure you've covered a lot of this ground already, but for me, it's relatively fresh. What does all of that mean?
It's a very high ceiling addition. This is the guy who was a top 5 24/7 Sports composite ranked player overall, not tight end, overall. And from talking to Rusty Manziel down in Georgia, who's known Arik Gilbert since he was, I think, in middle school, this is a tight end, a big body tight end that runs routes like a wide receiver. He was a freshman All-American at LSU. The big question is whether Nebraska is going to kind of be able to get the off the field stuff squared away with him, just because he had kind of a bumpy time at Georgia when he went home. So if that piece is okay, and I know Nebraska is very aware of kind of what Arik Gilbert's had to deal with in his past and kind of a plan to go forward. But I mean, I think there's certainly question, but if that pans out, that has the potential to be absolutely huge for Nebraska and Nebraska's offense. I mean, this is an NFL type player, and that's not, really kind of pumping things up. I mean, that was the expectation for him out of high school, and we'll see if Nebraska can kind of take advantage of his skill set if they can get everything kind of working elsewhere.
If you had to guess right now, Brian Christopherson, on February 10th, 2023, what tight end leads the room in receptions for the season, where in the world would you put your bet right now?
Arik Gilbert.
Is that easy?
Not necessarily, but if he gets everything squared away, he's already proven it. We can say like, oh, no, nobody has done it yet, but he actually kind of did his first year at LSU.
A really good year.
It was in the COVID season. I mean, that's your first year out of high school, and he actually more than lived up to his ranking, where he had 350 some yards. It was only in like 10 games too. They didn't play a full season that year. And I think he was getting double teamed by the end of it. People were really giving him a lot of notice. And yeah, things, there were some wrinkles that popped up, at Georgia, where he's got to come back and kind of reset and find it. But on the field, there's no doubt. I mean, I believe, weighs more than he's listed. He's listed at 260, I think, on the Husker site, and he's probably more than that. And he's just a matchup nightmare if he's out there. And so, yeah, we don't want to overdo it until he goes and proves it. But he did play in the SEC and has had a really good year. So I would say he's the answer to that question. But I kind of you could tell that Bob Wager, and I appreciate this, wasn't going to go down the trail of getting all into individual assessments yesterday, because he was asked about Thomas Fidone, and I was actually going to follow up with a Gilbert, and then I heard his answer to Fidone, and I realized he's right now in that mode where let's not just build some guy up. Let's let them all fight. There's other guys in that room. Borkercher's a guy I like. I know he had a couple drops early last year, and he was figuring it out as he goes, but he's a very young player. I think he's going to contribute, especially if you're using multiple tight ends. AJ Rollins is a guy who you heard was sort of on the cusp last year, and now it's a matter of if he can take that new step. Beyond those guys, others are going to have to show they have the stuff. I mean, we haven't heard enough about them to say anybody than those guys. And Hickman's got to stay healthy, and he struggled to put on weight, so there's a fight there. But it's an interesting room, because in years past, you felt better about they had that surefire 1A guy going into a season. And yet you would have to say with this room, it's probably the most if it all clicks, it could be fabulous. I mean, there's more upside than there's ever been. It's just sort of not with that established guy as much as there has been the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, there's 6 or 7 names that'll be in that room, maybe up to 8 by the time you get to the summer. I mean, we'll see if it all stays together. But you mentioned Borkercher, Gilbert, Fidone. Then you have Rollins, Carney, Androff, and Smith-Flores, Hickman. There's probably, being the state of Nebraska, there's probably some walk-ons in there as well. So it's a deep room for Bob Wager. All right, so you have a veteran high school coach making the jump to being a position coach in college, and you have the wonderkind, if you will, in Garret McGuire, who followed up and spoke as well on Thursday. And just from my perspective, watching the clips, reading the quotes, just kind of following along, I mean, certainly doesn't feel like someone who's uncomfortable up there, or he seemed very, very comfortable in that setting for a 23-year-old, 24-year-old. What were your thoughts, Michael Bruntz, on Garret McGuire?
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably more than anybody was the most anticipated interview, I think, of the crew that's come through.
The curiosity, if you would.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I was impressed with his answers. I think he's got energy, which I would hope, based off of the fact of his age, and it's his first, major college job. But to me, I don't really, I guess, have a lot of qualms with his ability to coach guys that are close to his age. I mean, it's Matt Rule sees something in him. I think we've heard from other coaches that they view his future in the profession as very bright and kind of on a rocket ride to wherever he's going. But I liked what I heard. I think he's excited. I think he's going to be really valuable in Texas. Another guy that's going to help him down there. And I think it helps that he's been a coach's kid. He said he talks to his dad every night about what he should be doing, things like that. I mean, I think he has the kind of community around him of coaches to where I don't think he's going to be left behind by any means with his coaching staff. And I think too, he kind of mentioned this is a coaching staff where you've got to be competitive, and I know Matt Rule doesn't like to hear that, but it's the type of staff where he's going to have to kind of have his elbows out and, recruit well, develop, and be on his game. So we'll see how it goes once they get on the field. But I mean, I thought he handled himself pretty well, for first time being in front of the Nebraska media.
BC, do you have anything different?
Bruntz hit it pretty well. I mean, 24 is the new 34 in coaching, right? I mean, there's a Minnesota hired a D-line coach that I believe is 24 years old. His advantage is the Minnesota D-line coach is a bigger guy who has facial hair, I think, like Schaefer. And that
doesn't look 24.
Yeah, it helps. Like, yeah, if I would say if Garret McGuire can grow a beard, that could help. But yeah, I thought this was the press conference where we had to get that out of the way. Like, there was the 4 to 5 questions about the age, because it's all people have talked about for a month or two, and then we can move forward. And I thought he handled it well, as just being like, kind of having some fun with it, being lighthearted. Like, I'm a 90s baby. And of course, Nebraska fans are doing the math. It was in our text chain that he was born in 1999, which is also the last year Nebraska won a conference championship. So maybe there's some sort of symmetry there or something, and it all connects. I don't think, though, he used a quote from Saban about how basically guys if they feel like your stuff, that's what they're waiting to see. First off, they want to see if you care about them. And I don't think that's going to be a problem. But then it's like, does this guy actually know his stuff? And if he proves that after a little bit, no one's going to give a crap like how old he is. I mean, they aren't. And guys are smart enough also to know his background. And like, that's the son of Joey McGuire, who's thought of as one of the better coaches, I think, right now. I think he's one of the better coaches in the country. I actually do. I mean, Joey McGuire, when you see what he's done at Texas Tech, and Garrett, basically since he was in the second grade, as he said, he knew he wasn't going to be a big time player. And so he was studying the art of coaching. He was living on the mat and those mat drills you do and stuff like that. That was his life, like being around that, sleeping in the office, like when his dad did and stuff like that. So he does actually have a 10 to 15 year probably advantage on some guys who get into this. And so I think you have to look at it that way. And also, Rule has a track record that he is confident in of taking pretty young coaches and seeing him excel. Fran Brown wasn't this young, but Fran Brown, he was hired as the director of internal ops at Temple when he was 28. And I mean, within the 10 years or so, now he's the DB's coach at Georgia and highly regarded. So, and there's more than that. So I think you look at the track record and say Rule's done pretty well at picking out guys.
No doubt about it. Let's take a quick time out. When we come back, we're going to dive into the Super Six that has been unveiled. You guys can talk about your decisions. We can, as a group, talk about how we all ended up with the same number one independently. All of that and more here on the Husker 24/7 podcast. Riley Van Poppel. All right. So we each had him number one on our Super Six. He finished number 3 overall. No surprise, Jeff Sims, number 1. Second year in a row, a transfer quarterback, number 1 on the Super Six. I sort of suspect, guys, that each time Nebraska takes a transfer quarterback, he's going to vault to the top of the Super Six rankings just by how these things tend to work. Did anything surprise you out of these 6 names where you had I mentioned Van Poppel and I mentioned Sims? Malachi Coleman was number 2. Ben Scott and Prince Will and Cam Lenhart finish out the rest of the Super Six. Anything in there surprise you about those 6 names, Michael Bruntz?
Yeah. Well, it's hard because we have the addition of transfers now. And so that adds a ton of potential to the mix. And then it kind of comes down to individual interpretation of how people make their list. If it's the person that's going to get on the field fastest and help, then yeah, I think Sims makes sense to me where he's at. I didn't even have him on my 6 because I kind of look at it as I've always looked at it more kind of holistically, like who, when their time is done at Nebraska, are you going to look back and say, this guy had a good career, or this guy, really kind of was a hit recruiting wise. So I tended to kind of go more towards the high school guys. Cam Lenhart's name on there surprised me a little bit of the high school guys. I know he's a composite 4-star, but that name was a little bit of a surprise for me. I was just going through my list because I was having trouble remembering, but I think Van Poppel just is that guy that when you talk to him, you see the way he plays, you see the defense Nebraska is going to be running, and it makes a lot of sense to me that he's going to be an impactful player by the time his time is done there. It feels a little bit like me to like a Ty Robinson situation, but maybe without the juice that Ty Robinson had coming in, because with Van Poppel, there really wasn't that big recruiting battle. They didn't send the whole staff down there to see him, that kind of thing. So that was, kind of why I went there. The one transfer I have, Ben Scott from Arizona State, I think he's going to be huge for that offensive line. Eric Fields, I think he was number 6 on my list. I think he just kind of fall in love with his film and kind of what he can do in that defense with a little bit more space and ability to run. And then I had Sam Sledge at number 5 on my list. I think he's a multi-year starter down the road. I just really like what he does on the interior of that offensive line. I don't know if I answered your question. I rambled, but that was my list. And I was surprised by Lenhart and maybe even a little bit by Sims.
That's okay. I think rambles are accepted on this podcast. We do it frequently. BC, are you going to ramble?
Probably. I usually do more than any of you guys. I just stuck with high school guys. But if you're going by just a year ahead, like the immediate impact, yeah, it's Sims. It's Billy Kemp.
Yeah.
I think Billy Kemp's going to be huge. Like, I could argue if you were just like, who are the additions of in this next fall, Billy Kemp, not only because I think he's going to be a high volume guy, but because I think he's going to be one of the leaders who sets the tone of how things are done in that room going forward. Ben Scott also. So those 3, but I kept it to the high school guys, sort of looking at it as Bruntz was saying, as far as like, they'll have more time to leave their mark on this program. Now, obviously, if Sims comes in and wins the job and is like a 2-year starter, that could be pretty significant for everything. But I had Maverick Noonan at 6, Coleman at 5, Jaden Doss at 4. I just think Doss is one of those guys. I'm not saying people forget about him, but I do think this happens in recruiting where he committed a while ago, and then there's the new names that pop up, and you kind of get lost in the shuffle. I had Alvano at 3. I know Tristan Alvano's popular. I just think he's gonna be dependable and decide a game or two throughout the years.
Will he win the job this next year?
I think
Bruntz is saying yes.
Yeah, I would pick. Yes, I would pick him, but I don't want to sell Timmy Bleekrode short. I thought Bleekrode was a little choppy last fall. He had good numbers by the end of it, but it didn't feel like as commanding near the end as maybe you hoped. I mean, he had the kick against Michigan that was like the 35-yarder that went about 36 and stuff like that. So, I think it'll be a good fight. The beautiful thing about that, real quick, is, I mean, as Ed Foley said, you can just look at the sheet, like who did better, on the numbers, and you don't have to really bring a lot of outside opinion into it. I had Eric Fields 2, and I had Van Poppel 1, and Bruntz laid out Van Poppel fine at why he's up there. He's just, I feel like even the floor for him is solid, and I always like guys like that on the Super Six. Like he mentioned Ty Robinson. Like Ben Stilley comes to my mind too as like a guy who, I mean, people can say, oh, he could have done more or this or that, but he was a multi-year starter. And if that was the floor you got out of any recruit, you would say, oh, that's pretty good. A guy who started several years and is, knocking on the door of NFL teams. So I think Van Poppel's that kind of guy, which is why I felt good about putting him 1. And Fields is up there because listen to the staff. I mean, they think they really got one there.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I had 5 of the 6 that were in the composite. The only difference for me, I didn't have Cam Lenhart. I went with someone that I know the previous staff was super, super high on because his ability to sort of play inside or outside. He put up great numbers in Texas. I thought his recruitment was kind of odd, and it was sort of all over the place, but he stayed committed to Nebraska the whole time. And I'm talking about Dylan Rogers. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a productive player. I like the film. The production was there, and there was definitely some teams Texas was legitimately interested at portions during his recruitment. And the previous staff really, really liked him as a guy that they thought could be either an inside linebacker, or if they needed to bring him off the edge on third down, they thought he could provide some pass rush that way. So I think Dylan Rogers is probably lost a little bit because of what Bruntz said earlier, a guy that committed earlier. He's not top of mind the way the December, January players are, but that's someone I think could be a pretty quality guy down the line. The other 5, I mean, we've kind of hit on, I'll say on Riley Van Poppel. I mean, the film is great. The attitude is great. I agree. I think he's got a really high floor, and he's just someone that I anticipate will be, a pretty good fit with this staff and a pretty productive player overall that you don't really have to worry about, a lot. Ben Scott, I had at number 2. I just think if you can lock away that center position for a couple years before you get to, I think one of you guys had Sam Sledge as your sleeper. I really feel like there's going to be this Scott to Sledge handoff, and that's going to be like a 5-year run of center play at Nebraska. And I think that's going to be a good 5-year run. So I kind of like how that lined up. Prince Will, I think, is a good player off the edge, and interesting kind of talent that we haven't seen Nebraska bring in a lot of. Could bulk up to being a defensive lineman. We'll see. Jeff Sims, I mean, all the talent in the world at quarterback. And then Malachi Coleman, raw athletic ability is undeniable. It's whether he can develop as a wide receiver is sort of the question that I have there. Now, for sleeper, I went with Sua Lefotu, who Nebraska added late in the class, in large part because they just haven't had a lot of those guys, a lot of that body type on the defensive line. I think he's someone that could develop over a couple years, be an interesting player. BC, I think you went with Ethan Nation as your sleeper. I know you've been pretty high on him. Why?
In a nutshell, because he just kind of reminds me of Hartzog in the sense that, yeah, he's a smaller statured guy, but whenever you see any clips of him, I just like how he locks people down. I mean, it doesn't seem like a guy who gives up much ground in anything I've ever seen on him. And I thought he was like a very true definition of sleeper. That's always hard to define. It's kind of funny when you look at the list, and I'm not knocking anybody, but you'll see some guys who have a sleeper and he's like also second or third on the list. So is he actually a sleeper? I don't know, but I think Ethan Nation, I don't hear people talk about him. So I just thought, like, that's a guy I really like whenever I see his stuff pop up. It could be some random, weekend workout he does where there's a minute of film on him. There was something of that going around a few days ago, and he looked good. But he's just one of those kids from down southeast who plays against, good competition, is used to being against good dudes, and I don't think is going to back down when he gets here.
And Bruntz, you had Sam Sledge. I kind of touched on him a little bit. Anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, I think he's a multi-year interior starter. I mean, I think that's what he's going to be. I think of that group of linemen that they signed in this class, I think he's probably the most intriguing to me. It's kind of too bad he couldn't enroll early because I mean, that would have given him a huge kind of leg up on getting started. But I just have always liked what he's able to do. I mean, he's played pretty much every position on the offensive line in high school, moves well. And, when your dad's a former all-conference offensive lineman, that doesn't hurt either. So here's a question for you guys. Based on kind of your list, I mean, this feels like a class that was kind of heavy on sleepers. Who was like your 1A sleeper or like your 1B, I guess? Like the sleeper that you almost went with, but I guess you're maybe sleeping on less or more. I don't know.
Two of my favorite players in this class that didn't get ranked or wasn't my sleeper, Vincent Carroll Jackson, who I think is really fascinating as a guy who's only played football for a short amount of time that looks like he has some really big upside. And then I don't know how to pronounce the name. I've been saying it wrong. But our friend Jason from South Dakota. Bruntz, how do you say the name?
Machachok.
Machachok. All right. So Jason Machachok. I mean, I think I initially had him as my sleeper, but then I was thinking about it, and it's like I've talked about him so much that how much of a sleeper is he at this point? I mean, I think he has huge upside on either side of the line. The more I've kind of looked back at things, it's such a nice addition for them right before the signing period. So those two guys, this class, I like a lot of what they did in the trenches. It's a lot of developmental guys, and maybe they're not all going to hit, but I really feel good about the work that they put in and getting players that I think are long-term developmental players in the trenches, and I think that's going to pay off.
Machachok is probably the first one I'd say, just because of his strength. And once in a while you can pull this off. And this, I don't know that it was intentional in this case, but you have that guy who's, especially in the Midwest, maybe in an area that's not seen quite as much. And you can kind of stow him away a little bit in the back of your mind until the last week or two. And other people aren't aware of him. And then everybody copies and offers him and stuff like that. And I don't think that was intentionally done in this case with the staff change and everything. But I do know Donovan Raiola from interviewing Machachok really liked him back in camp. Now it looks like he's going to start on the D line now. That's what's kind of come out in the last few weeks when he's done interviews with us. But initially it was thought he was going to be O-line, and Raiola really thought he had something. So you got to give Donovan Raiola, even if he doesn't end up with him, which I don't think he will, some credit on that. So that's a good one. I think Ramir Stewart could be a guy. I mean, they know that Philly area so well, and you kind of got to use that knowledge to inform your opinion and understand that this coaching staff hears everything about those guys in that area. And he was one of the guys they really singled out. And I think Quentin Ives, you could say the same thing about. Like, you don't hear him get talked about, but he's a guy that Barthel put in the legwork on, kind of following the last couple of years, and just really believed in the coach's evaluation on him. He's a multi-sport guy who's also really good at basketball. So it is definitely a class full of like sleeper guys. I mean, we don't even get to Ishmael Smith Flores and Charles and Bryce Turner. So this will be one of the most fascinating classes in like 3 years to go back and look at, when we do that sort of thing, just how it lands.
To kind of piggyback off of your thought, do you see this class is either going to supplement the roster and build a strong foundation, or it's going to be a bunch, like there's no in between for me. It's either really going to work or it's going to be a lot of misses. Like I I don't think there's a way where it's just sort of in the middle, which I know seems odd because most things are, but I really think it's either going to work very well for them or it's going to be a potential problem when you take 41 players in one single cycle. Bruntz, who did you have in mind when you asked that question?
No, I mean it was a question I kind of wrestled with as I was making my list of like, there's probably like 6 or 7 sleepers that I could have gone with. I went with Smith Flores because I think he's got the highest ceiling at that tight end spot of anybody that. But I mean, you start going down the list like Bryce Turner. I mean, he's a speed guy. Potential. Kind of like a lottery ticket almost, like we've said, where has the speed. Can they put it together on the field? Same with. Even to Jalen Lloyd, who we haven't even mentioned, kind of the same idea. So I didn't have anybody in mind, but I just know that I was really kind of struggling as we were going through the list of like, okay, there's obvious guys for this list, but I don't know that there's ever been that many sleeper possibilities in a class. And even some of the transfers, I mean, you use like an Elijah Judy. I mean, are we talking about him enough? I mean, this is a Texas A&M offensive lineman who is pretty well regarded and I think is going to have something to say about things this year. But I mean, you could make an argument that even some of those guys are kind of falling in that category as well.
All right. Do we want to say anything about basketball after Nebraska lost, 19 points, 21 points,
21.
something like that?
Yeah.
To Michigan on Wednesday. They do play Wisconsin on Saturday. There does seem to be some optimism about this matchup and playing at home. Any quick thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I think it's a game where they'll be in the fight to the end. I mean, Wisconsin's had trouble scoring the basketball. I love that phrase in basketball. Instead of just scoring, it's scoring the basketball, in case you forgot what they were using. But I think, it was kind of disappointing against Michigan, but sort of you kind of expect it is just the struggles defensively. I mean, Michigan got whatever they wanted. That game was 41-17, 13 minutes into it. Just 14 3-pointers. And that's the issue they're going to have the rest of the way. They have to give up something or multiple things to get something on the defensive end. Like if they want to take away this, they're going to have to live with, okay, like Penn State had a guy go off for 8 3-pointers. And that was just one of those deals on Sunday where you're like, okay, we're taking away this part, but we understand you're going to get your looks, and you got to kind of hope those guys just have a cold night. So I understand the pickle there, and I do expect sort of a grinder of a 64-60 type of game one way or another on Saturday.
Bruntz, who's the most Wisconsin basketball player of all time?
Oh, there's some. I mean,
is it? I don't think it's Brad Davison, even though he's probably one of the least liked players in the history of Big Ten basketball. Is it like a Frank Kaminsky?
I was going to go Kaminsky. There were a couple of guys that followed Kaminsky that I kind of put in that category
Ethan Happ.
Yeah, like Wisconsin, Iowa type players that are somewhat skilled. And they kind of have dad game. Like they shoot well from the outside. They play fine defense. They make plays that just kind of annoy you. And I think there's like a central casting type for Wisconsin players, but I would still have to say Davidson. I mean, he's kind of on the Mount Rushmore of like just under your skin Big Ten players like Aaron Kraft and I'm trying to think who else would be on that list, but
you got to finish this now that you've done it.
I know.
The 3-point shooter from Iowa, the shorter kid. Like he was on the same team as like Woodbury and those guys.
Yeah.
You know who it was when I was a kid? Was Jason Sutherland from Missouri. This is a Big 12 days, but he was a real man. He he got you fired up.
You could pick most players from Kansas' starting lineup most years, and they'd be on my Mount Rushmore of most annoying basketball players of all time. Sharon Collins, Brandon Rush. I didn't like Mario. Basically, that title team. Didn't like any of them.
I mean, Grant Gibbs is on there.
Grant Gibbs is definitely on. But if you're going just Big Ten, I'm trying to think of who else I would have on there. Do you take one of Purdue's like 75 8-foot bigs that they've had over the last years? Like, does Isaac Haas or whoever, does he make it? Or John Harms?
Maybe Wagner from Michigan. Yeah. He's probably on there. Yeah. Although I didn't really find him all that annoying. I mean, I think everybody kind of got his comeuppance that one game where the student section was just really riding him a few years ago. I don't know. I think probably Davison and Kraft are the two where you're like, these guys just need to get out of here.
That's fair. Do either of you remember Richard Roby at Colorado?
Yes.
He would have been on that list for Big 12 for sure.
Still kicking it around in the NBA with the Pistons.
Richard Roby's in the NBA?
I thought he was. Am I thinking of somebody else?
No, I think you might be thinking of somebody else.
I'm thinking of somebody else. Sorry.
You know what's funny about how the human brain works is, maybe just my brain is, I can remember, like, you can go into Big 12 or old Big 8 guys and get talking on that, and I can talk far better. It's not that I haven't paid attention in the last 10 to 15 years, but for whatever reason, as I get older, guys just slip in and out of your mind. And
I think that's fair.
But when you're like 12 years old, you know, those, when you're like, you're so dialed into everything and it's larger than life, like names from that era just stick with me like nobody's business. Like, well, I could.
That's perfect, because like one of the things I saw on Twitter was name a wide receiver from when like you were growing up in the NFL.
Yeah.
And like the first names that came to mind were like not particularly great receivers, but ones I remembered, like Curtis Conway from the Bears, Michael Westbrook with the Washington Redskins, and then Yancey Thigpen, who was like pretty good for the Steelers and Titans for like a 2-year stretch. And I think it's because of like video games. I remember these guys. They were receivers I had to throw to with my crappy Vikings in 1998 Madden.
I think of like Anthony Carter. He's like my first Vikings guy.
Really?
Yeah. Sterling Sharp from the Packers was a real nuisance. Art Monk, you know, like Gary Clark from
Art Monk. Wow.
Yeah, God, he was still in the league. He was in the league a long time, though.
Washington. You didn't want to go Steve Largent, or?
Yeah, he was around. I remember Steve Largent.
Bolitnikov, he was annoying.
Those guys are 80s guys.
Going back, I think I basically combined Richard Roby and Alec Burks into one Colorado player in my mind. Richard Roby, by the way, was still playing professional basketball as late as 2019 in Japan. So.
Okay. But he never made the NBA, right?
He did. And Alec Burks is in the NBA still currently with the Pistons. Brian and I almost went and saw him play in November. So,
oh, did we?
There's going to be someone that listens to this podcast all the way to the end, and then they're just kind of excited that Richard Roby got mentioned, and they can transplant back to 2008 Devaney Center with the whole crowd chanting "Dick" at him. So, you know, that's the sort of sophomore humor that will occur here.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, I suppose it's probably time to end this podcast. But if you enjoyed this content, we appreciate it, and we'll be back with more podcasts next week. And, of course, we'll have more stuff at Husker247.com, plenty of coverage. The Super Six, if you want to read through other individual ballots, that's up there. We've got plenty of 2024 recruiting coverage rolling along. Basketball is playing this weekend. Baseball starts next week. Baseball adds a commitment roughly every 3 days. I think they've started taking kids in the 2032 class. Is that right, Bruntz? He's shaking his head no.
That seems accurate.
But, yeah, I mean, that's what it feels like right now. So there's some 6th graders out there getting ready to commit. And we'll see how Will Bolt and the staff does. Bruntz will have all the coverage on that, as always. So be sure to check out Husker247.com. We'll catch you next week.